Welcome, everyone. My name is Stephen Boyd, and I'm the Dean of Enrollment Management here at HJI International Graduate School for Peace and Public Leadership. My pleasure to welcome you tonight. We thank you all for coming. I know that people are joining us from different parts of the U.S., but I can see from the name list, at least looking quickly, we've got our members of our community and our organization coming from all over the world. I see someone from Australia, from Austria, Canada, from Central Africa, and from other parts of the world. And forgive me if I didn't mention where you're coming from. Um, Really, we are so thankful that you could be here today. This is an historic event. This is the HJI's first international conference on peace and public leadership. Our theme throughout the next 3 days will be peace and public leadership, addressing the challenges of our time. As many of you know, part of HJI's mission is to be a center of thought. Beyond just being a home for education, advanced education for the unificationist and non-unificationist community, our hope is that this institution can become a center to create conferences, thought-provoking events which lead to a greater understanding of the world around us and a way to solve the problems that we face every day. We also hope, of course, that as you join tonight, it may provoke some interest on your part to study with us. So I will be putting my contact information into the chat box at some point during the program. If you're interested, you'll be welcome to contact me about programs of study or just simply taking one or two courses. So to begin our program, it's my true pleasure to be able to introduce tonight Dr. Thomas Walsh, who is president of HJI. Dr. Walsh is actually the inspiration behind this important historic event. In our pre-meeting before we opened it up to to all of you to join us, we were commenting on the fact this is the first time in HJI's history, all of our history, that we have sponsored this kind of international conference. So really the inspiration and the knowledge and understanding how to make this successful lies within Dr. Thomas Walsh. So please join with me in giving a very warm welcome to the president of HJI, Dr. Thomas Walsh.
Well, thank you very much, Dean Stephen Boyd. In my previous incarnation, I spent a lot of time organizing conferences. So I guess it's embedded in my DNA or some kind of acquired DNA over time. But I want to thank everyone for joining this evening for our 3-day conference on the topic of peace and public leadership, addressing the challenges of our time. Peace and public leadership is now in our name, HJ International Graduate School for Peace and Public Leadership. And I think many of you who are familiar with our UTS tradition, as we were called previously, and even the work of our founders, and more recently, the interjection from Dr. Hak Jahan Moon to underscore the importance of peace, not simply as a secular, let's say, geopolitical concept, but as kind of the core factor that applies to virtually all sectors of life, and we might say to some extent within academia, all divisions or departments of a university. So we remain true to our seminary roots, even as a graduate school. We remain clearly as a faith-based organization, institution rooted in core spiritual values that really define everything we do, because we sincerely believe that as we seek to address the challenges of our time, these spiritual values and faith-based values are extremely relevant and important. And I believe you'll see that demonstrated throughout this series of conferences. I want to now just take a moment to scroll through our schedule for the coming couple of days. We're now in session 1. Session 1 is going to last for about 4 more minutes, and we'll get into the heart of the conference. which will be session 2 on the topic of Unification Worldview and Conflict Transformation. I know this is a specialization of Dr. Ward and Dr. Perote, Dr. Ugorji, and Ms. Katerina Connery and Chris Kennedy. So I think it's going to be a rich session. Our session 3 will start after we conclude this session at 8:45 on an important topic, Christology and women. And the coordinators of this session are Dr. Shimio and Dr. Wilson, who've done a great job putting together what I think will be a rich and important program. I'm looking forward to it. As we move into April 12, which is Friday, we'll move to section 4, which is entitled Philosophical Issues in Religion and Peace. This session's been put together by Dr. Keisuke Noda. He is our Associate Dean of Academic Affairs, Associate Provost, and he and Dr. Brown will be the featured speakers for this session. Session 5 that follows on Friday at 10 a.m. has been put together by Dr. Michael Mickler, Distinguished Professor of Historical Studies, with the assistance of Dr. Franco Famularo, a graduate of HJI with the Doctor of Ministry degree. And I think this will be another important session. Session 6, which takes place at 2 p.m. On Friday, has been put together by Ms. Lynn Walsh, adjunct instructor at HJI, and our Title IX coordinator, and another strong group of panelists for an important session. Then we move into the topic that James Edgerly, together with Alan Jessen, who are the coordinators of this session, they put it together. They have been giving focus or attention to this concept that they refer to as economic democracy. In some ways, how to prevent the radical disparities of wealth that exists across the world. And they've brought together economists and theorists who've been working on this project for a long time. So we're happy to be working together with Jim Edgerly, who also runs the series known as the Higher Purpose Forum. Session 8, also on Saturday morning, I'm proud to be the coordinator of this session and moderator. And these are 4 other excellent students from HJI. They took a course of mine on the United Nations and civil society, and they will each present what I think you will find to be very, very strong presentations based on their research. And then our final main session has been pulled together by the director of our Doctor of Ministry program, Dr. Drissa Kone. The title is Prospects for Peace in Israel and Palestine. We have Bishop Munib Yunan from Palestine. We have Imam Samshi Ali, based here in New York, a major interfaith leader in America, and Mr. Roni Smolar from Finland, and bringing in a Jewish perspective, but also generally an expert on affairs of the Middle East. We will have a brief closing session immediately following session 9. So I just wanted to, that you can just refresh your memory of the series of sessions. Once again, thank you so much for being here. Look forward to any feedback you have. Thank you for joining. And without further ado, I turn it back over to Dean Boyd to introduce our moderator for session 2.
Thank you very much, Dr. Walsh. We would like to begin our program now, and our first session is Dr. Walsh explained, is on Unification Worldview and conflict transformation. Our moderator for this first session is Ms. Katerina Connery, Vice President for the Women's Federation for World Peace in the United States and current Doctor of Ministry student here at HJI. So let's welcome Katerina.
Thank you, Dean Boyd, and thank you, Dr. Walsh. And yes, welcome everyone. We're so glad to see you and to have all of you here engaging in this conversation together with us. This session, as mentioned, is Unification Worldview and Conflict Transformation. We have some excellent presenters this evening, and I hope we can get a lively discussion going on this very relevant and important topic. Since you are here in this conference, I think you all agree that the pursuit of peace is important and critical at this time. But how can we build a sustainable peace? Something that goes beyond simply ending a conflict, but also building a presence of mutual respect, of transformed relationships, genuine understanding. And the Unificationist worldview can offer a lot to that conversation. So tonight in this session, we'll be discussing some innovative approaches to understanding the so-called other, exploring the nature of American foreign investors, past, present, and possible, of American foreign interventions, rather, past, present, and possible future. And also we'll be investigating the role of desire satisfaction versus degrowth in peace processes. So it's very interesting and exciting. Before we get to the main content of this panel, I wanted to cover a few housekeeping items. First, we will have 3 presenters and 2 respondents. And at the end, we will have a Q&A. So throughout the session, throughout the presentations, please post your questions in the chat. We'll be taking questions from the chat, and we will do our best to get to as many questions as we can, time allowing. I know there's going to be a lot of things to say and stimulating a lot of thoughts, so please post them in the chat. And when you do post a question, please do state your name and your affiliation so we know who you are. And you can decide whether you want to address your question to the entire panel or to a specific presenter. So I will introduce each speaker briefly, but you can see their longer bios in the chat as well. They'll be posted there. And also a reminder that this session is being recorded, so you can find the recording later on the HJI YouTube page, the YouTube channel. So without further ado, let's go into our main topics for today. First, we have Dr. Thomas J. Ward. He will be presenting about China and Taiwan, competing narratives. Dr. Ward is Provost and Professor of Peace and Development at HJI. He also served as the 6th president of this university. He is an author of multiple publications and recipient of a Fulbright scholarship. So please, Dr. Ward, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Katerina, and thanks to all of you who have joined us this evening for this historical event, as we've already heard. My topic this evening specifically relates to competing narratives. I'm going to share my screen and basically go through a PowerPoint, as much of it as I can. We don't have a lot of time tonight, but I'll do my best to cover as much of the topic as is possible this evening. A secondary title, I can say, to my presentation this evening, because we do want to introduce some unification content here, is Narrative Mediation and the Unification Concept of Han, and we'll see how it applies to the competing narratives in the case of Taiwan. Some of you might have heard of a book called Narrative Mediation. It was written in 2001 by John Winslade and Gerald Monk. John Winslade is a counselor, and Gerald Monk is a psychotherapist. And it's interesting that a lot of people who have gotten into the field of peace studies and conflict resolution have come from the field, first of all, of counseling and psychotherapy. So this is actually a text which particularly applies to more familial issues and more interactive issues between personalities. But it has been used since as recently as 2000, as early as 2008, to be applied likewise to conflict resolution. I want to say I think it's an important means of viewing things, but it's not the only means. So I'm not trying to give an endorsement saying this is the only way. I'm simply saying that's an interesting approach to consider. People have narratives that justify why they're doing what they're doing. And narratives create a sense of entitlement. People have expectations because of the narrative that they have developed to explain their position and why they believe that their position is right. And narrative mediation is meant to disarm a conflict, provide different perspectives. In their text, for example, Winslade and Monk give the case of two married adults who are contemplating divorce. And they have so many reasons why each of them is right. And what's emphasized in this case is, okay, we've heard your views. Do you realize what damage you're doing to your children? Have you listened to your children? Have you heard what your children are going through as a consequence? It's a way to disarm the conflict and say, whoa, I can't just be thinking about why I'm right. There are other voices here that are important voices that I also have to pay attention to. And it's a process through which transformation can occur. Space can open, there can be momentum, and step by step, well, there can be conflict transformation through this particular mode. Behind every conflict, there is a view. And not just a view, but in this particular presentation, I want to emphasize that there's a feeling that from the subjective view of each party in the conflict, there's a sense of having been mistreated, violated, somehow dealt with unjustly, and for that reason, they are seeking some kind of vindication or correction. I believe that there is merit to consider the possible role of incorporating within this narrative mediation process the role that what unificationists and also Koreans refer to as Han, the role that it might be able to play. I want to thank Dr. Perrotte. He recently gave me an essay pointing out that even within Korean, the notion of Han is an unclear term. And some even question whether it's actually genuinely a Korean term or it's a term that was actually imposed from outside Korea to be applied to Koreans, even though there's a lot of ownership about this. And I'm happy to refer people to that, or you can ask Dr. Perrotte about that more. Three dimensions of the human mind, which we're all familiar with, are intellect, emotion, and will. In our Western tradition, often we emphasize that human beings are Homo sapiens. And also one of the key Cartesian propositions is, I think, therefore I am. The fundamental essence of a human being is that he or she thinks. However, in the unification perspective, more central to a human being than intellect is emotion. And sometimes Dr. Sang-Hoon Lee referred to a human being not as Homo sapiens, but as Homo amans. I care, therefore I am. Ultimately, do we say a person is good or bad because of his or her intelligence or because of the fact that we've felt love and goodness from them? I think that this perspective is a valuable perspective that emphasizes and highlights the role of emotion. So emotion assumes primacy in the unification view, and therefore the prioritization or order in the unification understanding of the human mind is emotion first, intellect second, and will third. In the unification worldview, an essential emotional state is Han. And this is the Chinese character for Han. And if you look at this, the radical, particularly on the left side, is actually the radical heart. It means heart. It's like an abbreviation in the character for heart. And on the left, you have the character Riang, which kind of means excellence or virtue. So it brings these two characters together. Interestingly, the word for Han, the Chinese characters for Han, are almost exactly the same except reversed as the characters for conscience. And if you think about conscience, you recognize that conscience is something which is intuitive. Sorry, I didn't mean that. It's something which is intuitive. And likewise, Han, the ability to sense the deep feelings of others, that's intuitive. It takes time. We can develop, we can refine our sense of conscience, but we can also refine our sensitivity to others. Some are more capable of doing it than others. You've heard of emotional intelligence, for example, but it's something that can be cultivated and is highly useful, particularly in the field of conflict resolution. And in terms of the unification worldview, an essential emotional state in today's world is Han, and that is the notion of pain. And in some sense, it can reflect, as I said, this is a term that's constantly being redefined and reviewed, but even it might incorporate guilt and regret due to the current circumstances, for which one harbors a sense of partial responsibility, while also harboring a continuing aspiration for transformation. In other words, Han isn't just resentment. Han isn't just anger, but somehow it says, I have something to do with this, and also a belief that somehow we can still get out of this. I want to do more to somehow correct it. It's so painful, but I want to do what I can to correct or reverse this. Understanding the Han of one's counterpart, I want to suggest here, can contribute to conflict transformation. Just take a moment and think about people's political views, whether you are right or liberal or center, whatever your political views might be, or whatever political personality you identify with. I think if you're really honest with yourself, you'll find that the bottom line of your political views is an affective thing. It's not just intellectual. It's an affective thing. Somehow you see something in the person or in a message that really inspires you, and not just intellectually. My first real experience of what I could refer to as political Han took place some 40 years ago, at the time of the Malvinas Island or the Falkland Islands War between the United Kingdom and Argentina. I happened to have gone through Argentina during that period of time. And one of the things that really shocked me, was I saw people crying about those islands. They were so important to them, and the fact that for a few weeks they'd gotten them back, they cried about it. It somehow was that meaningful. And if you go on YouTube, if you happen to speak in Spanish, there are some beautiful, very, very affective, very emotionally touching songs about those islands because of the love that the people feel for those. And that's why I feel that we can also apply some of those emotions if we consider the case of the struggle between Beijing and Taiwan, that we're all living on a regular basis nowadays. Taiwan, that tiny island at I think less than 100 miles off the coast of mainland China. And it was in October 1st, 1949, very early on in his leadership, that Mao Zedong evoked the term century of humiliation, that there somehow was the need to vindicate China from what had happened in 1839 during the first Opium Wars, where suddenly, by surprise, China found itself somehow overtaken by Great Britain. And there were 18 to 20,000 casualties. But that was only the beginning. It was so humiliating because due to that entrance of so much opium into the China market, there were many people that suffered from opium addiction. And China was divided into various spheres of influence, including Europe and Japan states. And those spheres of influence really reduced China to less than a country. It was Mao Zedong who step by step was able to get back China. First of all, Tibet and the Xinjiang province. You know that Stalin basically wanted the Xinjiang province for himself. He wanted to have a special relationship with it. Likewise, Inner Mongolia. And then it was under Deng Xiaoping where finally Hong Kong was able to be returned to China. And the final humiliation in all of this, the one outstanding issue that still remains, is Taiwan. Taiwan has not been returned. And it's a constant reminder, or at least that's what the Chinese feel, about what happened so long ago when China lost its identity as a nation. And it's not a full nation yet. Because of this, they would argue. And Xi Jinping feels he's under tremendous pressure at this time to get that back. So sometimes we have to also be able to look at, I'm good. We have to also, at the same time, we have to look at the situation in terms of Taiwan, led by Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek was involved in a fight for democracy. But in the case of Taiwan, there were two populations. There was the population, 15% of the population that came from China that said they were fighting for democracy. And then there were those who had been there for hundreds of years who suddenly were exposed to Chiang's leadership. And every year in February, there's a march in order to honor the victims of when Chiang's forces came in. And they took the lives of some, again, 18,000 people. There is a museum in the center of Taiwan, which is called the 228 Museum, which remembers those people that were victimized at that time. And constantly this issue comes up.
You have 3 minutes remaining.
Very good. And so there is this thought on the Taiwan side. What about those of us who were victimized by nationalist China? There's a very bad sense of feeling towards Chiang Kai-shek. There's now a park that has 200 statues of Chiang Kai-shek in one place because they want to have nothing to do with him. In 2017, when a statue honoring the Japanese was decapitated, almost immediately after that, 2 statues of Chiang Kai-shek were decapitated. And the sign there is 228, remembering February 28, when some 18,000 people began to be wiped out by the forces of Chiang Kai-shek. So to conclude, there is a conflict, as we know, between Taiwan and China. And at the basis of it on both sides is a sense of entitlement. When the Taiwanese see China, they see Mao, they see Deng Xiaoping, and they see Chiang Kai-shek. And when the Chinese see Taiwan, they see the United States, and they see the century of humiliation. China has emerged today as one of the world's powers. So does Taiwan really want to separate itself from this completely, forever? And Taiwan has become a respected and model democracy and an example of rule of law in East Asia, following the pattern of Japan and Korea. Does Beijing really want to destabilize that? And at what cost does it want to do that? Deng Xiaoping was successful in somehow seeming, at least, to be flexible. And it would seem that on all sides in Taiwan, this is the past President Tsai, but I wanted to, because she was so inflexible. And also Xi Jinping is so inflexible. There's need to be able to have flexibility and openness and an effort to understand each other's pain if we're to have peace. Taiwan and Beijing would improve if each could move away from narratives of entitlement and understand each other's harm as a next step. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Ward. That was very enlightening. And wow, I wrote down so many different points. And everyone, I hope you can post your questions in the chat for the Q&A at the end so that Dr. Ward can explain more if desired. I know there's a lot more to this story. And, understanding the narratives and the Han behind these historical realities. Actually, I am the respondent for Dr. Ward, so I will be setting my timer for myself as well. Yeah, and just listening to Dr. Ward's presentation, and I received what I received beforehand, and thinking about this concept of Han and applying it to a conflict situation. I agree that this can be something that's very helpful and useful in understanding the motivations and the underlying interests in a conflict. I feel that every person has a fundamental need to be seen, to be heard, to be understood, and to be accepted. And that need doesn't change whether we're talking about the individual level or working on the national, international level, because these nations are made up of people who still have that need to be understood. And much of the conflicts we see in the world are because that need is not being met. Actually, Dr. Ward's comments made me think of Marshall Rosenberg and nonviolent communication. And one of his key phrases is, do you want to connect or correct? What's our motivation here? Are we connecting, building the relationship, healing the relationship, repairing what has gone wrong? Or are we trying to correct, say that I'm right, you're wrong, my narrative's right? And a lot of the negative emotions point to an unmet need. So we have to address the need, not the emotion. In this example of China and Taiwan, and I know there's more to share, they've experienced this history and they have their, own interpretation of what happened. And I think for those of us who are striving to add our own perspective, or, I think there are a couple of caveats to add to this conversation. First is, I think we have to be clear on what's the purpose of understanding the other's Han, because understanding does not need to equal agreeing, right? Understanding each other is not a game of comparison or determining which pain is deeper or which one's more acute or more important, but just acknowledging and understanding as a goal or end in and of itself. And each side's Han is legitimate and doesn't need to be compared with each other, because that can lead to blaming, it leads to shaming, and shame is destructive to any organization or any group of people. So, once that understanding is reached, then what to do next can be dealt with separately. And this isn't an easy thing, as Dr. Wood mentioned. Those emotions easily override our reason, no matter how highly trained we are. And my second caveat I think I'd like to add to this conversation is I think we need to be aware that when we're talking about China or Taiwan, these are collectivist cultures rather than individualistic cultures. So I'm thinking, okay, what is the source of their Han? Yes, there are historical realities, there's their interpretation of these events, but also this shame that is experienced by the collective as a group. It's less about the individuals were hurt or there was pain, but we as a people. I know that I'm Western, I'm an American, so I identify more with the individualistic culture, my right and everything, and I was hurt. But, for us who are Western, might be looking at a collectivist culture, we have to try to wrap our minds around, okay, what does that mean? That we were shamed. One theory I came across recently was this face negotiation theory, from Dr. Stella Ting Toomey. So saving face is related to our reputation, how we want to be seen by others, and collective cultures tend to be more concerned about preserving the face of others and also the mutual face. It's kind of funny terms, but our collective reputation is more important for collectivist cultures. So collectivist cultures tend more to emphasize the we instead of the I. So in these cases, such as Taiwan and China, other collectivist nations in conflict, I think we have to think about, what is that collective Han that we share? And maybe in cases where a respected leader who is elevated to a high status, the shame of that leader is also the shame of all of us. And it's kind of a shared experience. So then when we are looking at the Han, the pain, the resentment, the feelings, the emotions, we have to think of it on a wider level than just the individual actors. And then maybe in approaching it, we need that perspective. So that was my response that I would just like to add to that conversation. And I know there's more to say, so I just hope everyone can post something in the chat. I saw a couple of questions, so I hope we'll be able to get to them during the Q&A. So moving on to our next presenter, we have, let me pull up this bio here. We have Mr. Christopher Kennedy. He will be speaking about Pax Americana and the responsibility to protect. So Mr. Kennedy is a cybersecurity certified professional with a Master's of Science in Chemistry from George Mason University. He specializes in data science and emerging AI technologies. So without further ado, please take it away, Mr. Kennedy.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you all this evening. Let me go ahead and share the appropriate screen. Share. All right. Now, despite my specialties, we will not be talking heavily about AI or other sciencey things tonight. Instead, we will cast our gaze backwards, because everything that is came from something that was. Therefore, let's go ahead and look at the history that has led us to this moment in time. Now, to do that, I'm going to explore various eras in America's history and the evolving justifications for American expansion or for intervention abroad. That said, I'm not going to go all the way back to the founding. In many ways, the modern American policies began with the turn of the century, around 1898, which was a very crowded year.
I'm sorry, Mr. Kennedy, would you mind putting your screen in full screens? Yeah, share this.
All right, does that work?
If you go to slideshow and then present from the slide. Yes, there you go.
Right.
Thank you so
much.
much.
You can see this?
Yes.
Okay,
much better.
Does that work?
Yes.
Okay, good. Now, where were we? Yes, our overview. We're going to 1898, turn of the century. There were a lot of things happening at that time across the globe, actually. In many ways, this was the beginning of the global era. But for America in particular, this was around the time that the Wild West was closing down. But American policy still had this idea of manifest destiny behind it. So, kind of pressed on by that and some very poor economic conditions that were taking place in the looming past of the American Civil War, there was this Spanish-American War that came up, which, as Senator Henry Cabot Lodge claimed, went as a manifestation of a new large policy aimed at expanding American power and influence. Now, the Spanish-American War was done in response to the assertion that the Spaniards were treating their people very badly in their colonies, to such a degree that it was considered unchristian, and America, as the nearest designated power, ought to go do something about it. This might not have done anything unto itself, but there was also this idea that it'd be very economically lucrative to do it. The Philippines, in particular, were a very good trade partner for the emerging markets of America. So there was this dovetailing effect of this desire to spread American virtue and civilization, but also the need to expand the markets to overcome an economic downturn on the continent. But many people recognized this as a new form of imperialism, and they were having none of it. America was founded on democratic institutions and willing participation. So there was a very strong clash at that time. People got very, very heated. But ultimately, the economic factors won out. Things turned over, and eventually we began to annex these territories that we had initially fought Spain with to free. So we annexed the Philippines after a very brutal counterinsurgency, and we annexed Hawaii that same year. And it just began this new policy of gradual expansion. However, it is incompatible with American values to have to fight a counterinsurgency to bring territories into the United States. As a result, people became very disillusioned with that sort of intervention and direct expansion, because the counterinsurgency that had to be fought in the Philippines was extremely brutal. We wouldn't see that kind of fighting again for many years. But after it was over, well, people decided they wanted to shift how they were going to do things. America no longer wanted to be a militarily conquering pseudo-empire. Instead, they want to focus on economic ties, particularly in Latin America. So many people have mistakenly said that this was a form of isolationism. America has never been isolationist. They have, however, preferred economic ties with others over military engagement and entanglement. This term isolationism came up later as a way to sort of say, oh, you don't want to intervene in this war, you're an isolationist. But no, America is not an isolationist nation, and it never has been. It has always been very choosy about what it does instead. But even so, during the 1930s and 40s, these large fascist empires began rising up in Europe. For a while, America did not want to engage in these things. These fascists were considered to be European problems. And last time we had tried to militarily intervene a lot. We had had to pay a lot of money and it didn't work out well. Everyone felt bad after. And then Japan bombed Pearl Harbor and everyone got entangled again. So this was actually very fortunate for Europe because by the end of things, and mind you, the public was still ambivalent pretty much for the entirety of World War II about wanting to fight this war. But after the fact, everything became justified as we were doing this to protect democracy and Western liberalism against all these terrible fascists. And that's kind of how we write history now, but it was not how we did it at the time. But even so, America ended up winning pretty big. At the end of World War II, the United States had the only intact economy in the world. It had the world's only superweapon. It was, in effect, the only superpower. But at the same time, America no longer believed that it could stay only economically entangled with others. Because it had the only true economy and it had the only truly intact military forces, it became into the public domain that America had to be the one to militarily police different areas of the world to keep them from falling back into the chaos of World War II. Unfortunately, this is also the rise of communist ideology and the Soviet power bloc. Now, the United States and the other Western powers did not like communism for very good reasons we don't need to go into here. But this meant that this became an ideological battle. And the United States entered into a containment policy to try and keep the spread of communism as limited as possible. Now, the containment policy led to proxy wars such as Korea and Vietnam. And more than virtue or ethics, it really considered things on a realpolitik level. That if they let too many nations accrue into the Soviet power bloc, that it will be difficult to regain ground later. However, I also found during the course of research that really the containment policy was a reflection of a poorly calibrated understanding of local power dynamics. For instance, in Vietnam, although the Viet Cong were communist, they had a very strong nationalist bent that was completely incompatible with the Soviet centralization tendency. In other words, if we had left them alone, then they would have had incredible friction with Moscow. They probably would not have been able to get any kind of support versus the South, and probably would have failed on their own without anyone touching them at all. Furthermore, containment policy as we enacted it did not understand other local areas, particularly in Asia. Many of the military interventions used ended up backfiring. Because of that sort of thing, George Kennan, the architect of the containment policy, later cautioned that there was significant over-militarization of U.S. foreign policy, and that we had been neglecting diplomacy and non-military tools of power. This is a trend that will continue for many decades. But as another example, you consider China once it began to liberalize some of its economic policies. Once it did that, we let them do it. We opened up trade with them, and this caused incredible internal friction within the Soviet bloc as China began enriching itself. In the Soviets' eyes, they were enriching themselves at the expense of their other communist partners. And this caused significant havoc within the internal dynamics of the USSR and the other communist nations. It wasn't the military that did this, it was just letting one side have variable interaction with the West. But, as we know, we ended up winning the Cold War in many ways, regardless of those blunders. In the post-Cold War, well, the Cold War ended in the eyes of many people with the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. But I would point out that the regional dynamics of power and interaction stayed intact and remain intact in many ways. The names on the maps have changed. The characteristic of many relationships have not changed. But even so, with the Cold War era over and victory over communism declared, in the post-Cold War era, there was a significant shift in the justification for U.S. interventions. There began to be a great emphasis on humanitarian concerns and the protection of civilians. The United States emerged as a leading advocate for what we now call the responsibility to protect principles, which hold that the international community has a responsibility to intervene to prevent genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity, regardless of where those crimes occur or who perpetrates them. In many ways, such interventions are the key component of American policy in the 1990s. You might remember Haiti, the Balkans, Kosovo. All these were early positionings of the new hyperpower in the world, the American power, trying to assert a policing role at a regional level, not ideologically, but in something new, some kind of restructuring of American values. And I want to point out that term hyperpower. The Soviet bloc had collapsed. The Western bloc was the only game in town. And so some scholars have been calling America during the 1990s a hyperpower, superior to all other entities across every axis of measurement. But what we see is that there were some problems with this new dynamic. In practice, it became impossible for America to consistently apply its desire to intervene for humanitarian reasons. It made commitments in different regions of the world, such as Afghanistan, that it could not sustain. It also had problems determining what was victory. Without the ability to define victory and goals, a quagmire formed in many parts of the world where America attempted to intervene, particularly since much American intervention remained of a military nature, as opposed to coalition building or diplomacy.
You have 3 minutes left.
All right, let's do a sprint. So what we see is that there has been significant fatigue over the past 10 to 15 years as America's interventions continue to sort of fall apart after the fact. We had the recent Afghanistan debacle. We had Syria before that. We had increasing trouble with our interventions, particularly in the Middle East. So we spent, by some estimates, about $8 trillion in Afghanistan and Iraq together. And there was no end in sight, really. Now what we see is that we have begun to restructure internally to try and determine how we're going to treat a more multipolar world. In many ways, America is no longer considered a hyperpower because there's been an emergence of other large economies, such as China. And this means that we don't have complete unilateral control over everything. So America is undergoing internal reformation about how it's going to use its resources. What kind of interventions can it do? How can it sharpen its neglected tools of diplomacy and economics in the shaping of foreign policy? These are all problems for the future, but also for right now. Many people are saying that It is unpopular for us to be in many places in the world, but it is not realistic, and nor is it wise for us to pull out of other global interests. America is still the guarantor of global freedom. We police the world's sea lanes. We help keep any expansionist powers in check just by existing. We still form the core of many global national coalitions. But it's true that we need to actually look with a critical eye to how we are prosecuting our policies and what those policies actually are. We need to learn how to really determine what is victory and what is success. Because right now, all these little dots in this map are territorial disputes. Here in particular, China just fights with everyone. They're always in a dispute with its neighbors. And so I just like everyone to take away from this that America is still a great power, but we must overlook our desire to just use military intervention. We don't have just a hammer in our toolbox. We have other tools that we haven't used particularly well until now, but they are the key to helping us maintain a peaceful global dynamic. Pax Americana is still in effect, and we can preserve and maybe even strengthen it over time. Well, it's been wonderful presenting to you, but I'm about to get booted off. I hope you found this edifying, and I welcome your questions and look forward to a stimulating discussion.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Kennedy, for your informative presentation. Let's give him a round of applause. And yes, please do post your comments and your questions in the chat. One main takeaway for me was in looking at that history of American interventions is the need for very clear goals for why are we intervening and what is the desired outcome, and using other tools than just military, because we can think about, well, what about cases where we didn't intervene, where there was a humanitarian crisis, or maybe there's an intervention connected to another maybe self-serving interest. And so I think, yeah, that point about having clear goals is very important. So thank you very much. I hope everyone got some good pointers, and I'm just loving the questions in the chat so far. So I'm looking forward to the Q&A when we can really get into some of those questions. So for next, we're going to hear from our next presenter, and then our second responder will be responding to both Mr. Kennedy and our next presenter, Dr. Perrottet. So Dr. Perrottet, Dr. Claude Perrottet, he will be presenting about human desire as a counterintuitive source of peace. Dr. Perrottet holds a PhD in philosophy of religion from Université Laval. He has published a book on Kant's influence on Paul Tillich in 2012, and various other articles on Tillich, Zen Buddhism, and unification studies. So please, Dr. Perrottet, the floor is yours.
Good evening, everyone. I was so fascinated by the previous presentations that I literally forgot that now is my turn. So I will do my best. One thing that I can certainly do is share my screen. Okay, so my presentation is about human desire, which is probably surprising to some of you, as a counterintuitive source of peace. And it will be about the comparison between the role of human desire and that of duty, which is typical to Kant's presentation, Kant's philosophy, and his views also on world peace. To start, I will, and by the way, I will not read everything that's printed on the screen. It's just too long. So you can always go back to the recorded version and pause and read if you're really interested. I will start with a few brief considerations about the role of basically all of us. That means peace brokers, peace organizations, or just simply people who want to help bring peace to the world. So the first comment here, or the first point, is that when anybody mediates or tries to mediate to bring peace to a certain place, the probably first quality is to try to be invisible, because it's not about you, it's about the people. So whatever convictions you personally have, it's not about them. It's about your ability to appear credible to the parties and bringing them together. And the example that I've posted at the bottom left, Sant'Egidio, it's a very it's a Roman Catholic association that was called to mediate between two parties and formerly Marxist Mozambique. And neither party was interested in what they believed in, but they believed that they were bona fide, they really meant it, and they had no second motives. They didn't want to get something out of it. That's why it worked. Now, secondly, nevertheless, even though you try to disappear as a mediator because it's not about you, but you are still informed, inspired, motivated by whatever your beliefs are, especially if they're religious. And the founder of Sant'Egidio says as much. He says that his reliance on divine guidance through prayer was essential to the success of their mediation. So it's private, but it's there. Now, third step, if you will, is that for those situations where the matter is not just to resolve a particular conflict between two entities, but when the goal is much wider, long-term, wide scope, in-depth, to create peace, then it is necessary, and I give as an example UPF, the Universal Peace Federation, which you probably all know. If you look at their mission statement, I don't have it here, it expresses something of that sort: wide, deep, and long-term conflict transformation, not just resolution, not solve a particular problem, but create a situation where everybody can happily and peacefully live together. When you want that, then you need an overall strategy based on some consistent insights and worldview, understanding of human nature, obstacles and opportunities. And I mentioned UPF, but historically, the example is Immanuel Kant's Perpetual Peace. Now, his Perpetual Peace was a book. He was not a head of state, but it was immensely influential, in particular as an inspiration for the creation of the United Nations. Now, I have no time to explain it. Some of you heard it from me before, maybe, but just very briefly, Kant's Perpetual Peace has an absolutely wonderfully inspiring vision. You can read it yourself and you will tell me if you agree. Kant speaks of perpetual peace as something that's destined to happen. Otherwise, why would God have created the world if it was to leave us the way we are? And he calls the ultimate goal the kingdom of God on earth. It's quite unusual, I would say, the least. But number two, he also has very precise and systematic and very applicable steps, concrete steps that he presents, preliminary articles, definitive articles, many of which have been applied in international politics since then. That's the good point. Now, secondly, something I usually haven't spoken so far, if you look more carefully into Kant's writings, especially towards the end of Perpetual Peace, he nevertheless admits that there are some insuperable limitations in our human nature, essentially our self-centeredness, that makes that kingdom of God on earth forever just aspirational. We can approximately reach it, but we will never get there completely. So that's kind of lots of cold water suddenly. And this terminology is full of approximation, hopefully, should, etc. So number three, what we are left with is still very important. Kant was convinced that through the development that he explains, that I cannot go over, the creation of institutions, international institutions, we will be able to reach a point of no return. That means a point at which things are not perfect and they will never be perfect, but a return to war will never be, becomes unconceivable. So that's what he thinks can absolutely be achieved. And the question then, is it realistic to expect such a thing to work? Can we realistically reach a point where war will never come back, even without solving the more fundamental issues in human nature? And that will be my next slide. Two questions that result from this. How irreversible was that irreversible progress that Kant announced some 200 plus years ago? Well, he did it in part based on his experience with the American French revolutions. Much of it was horrible, especially on the French side, but still the change, indeed, it was a permanent change. The old regime never came back, briefly in the 19th century, and the United States never became a colony again. Now, was that a peaceful 200 years? No. Next, the United Nations, which represents essentially what Kant had in mind to achieve this permanent peace, or perpetual peace, though imperfect. The United Nations has tried very hard, as had the League of Nations, but I think I don't need to explain the limitations. Now, Kant would say that the United Nations did not apply one thing it should have, and that is it accepted non-democratic nations. So he would have a point on that. And if you see the current situation in the world, we had a brief illusion of a new world order in the 90s, but especially recently, I think I don't need to explain that the idea that we have reached a point where we can never go back to war doesn't apply. The second point is, how much desirable would that even be? The way that Kant sees this as inevitably happening is forced by the hands of nature through the advantage of commerce, which encourages everybody, even if they don't like it, to make peace. He even says that even a race of devils, as long as they're intelligent, they will make peace. So you see, it's very practical, not very much moral. And actually, he says morality is not required. Goodness of heart is not required. Why? Because if peace depended on that, it will never happen. So, but the key element in all that, all the others being supporting in a supporting role, is the call of duty. It's the duty of people to make peace. Reason requires it. So this is a quote by Kant that expresses that. I will skip. Then, okay, we are left with the notion of duty. Duty has a problem. I'm sure many of us feel very uninspired by the idea that we have perfect peace because we are all dutiful people. But additionally to that, duty has a problem, is that it itself contains an element of conflict between what I should do and what I feel like doing. So, and Kant explains that between human desire, which we can never quite overcome, and which he sees as essentially selfish, and duty, there will always be a problem that will make peace forever unattainable, at least in its perfect form. Now, this is not about Kant, and I'll leave him starting now. He has been abundantly criticized, I think, and I've explained it elsewhere, that he is not even consistent with himself. But the point is that much of today's discourse on peace and international relations is written in language of duties or rights and obligations, the UN Charter and so on, rights and obligations. So there's a vision, that's great, but everything, the modus operandi, is essentially keeping abuses and violence in check. And in reference to Chris Kennedy's presentation, liberalism, or the liberal democracy of the United States, has often imposed peace by force. Think the war in Iraq, and not been very different from realistic, the school of realism, say China or the previous Soviet Union. So desire, of course, it's suspicious. Whenever you hear desire, you feel, not very relevant. Who cares that I would like to have a Maserati? Or suspicious because it's expected to be a selfish. and that's what Kant says. However, the notion of desire needs to be reconsidered, I believe, in light of the limitations of obligation-based policies, which we see work a little bit, but not very well. And the main point is it's difficult to imagine that to have a real peaceful world in which people's legitimate aspirations are not being acknowledged. That's the notion of harm that Dr. Ward spoke about. When these aspirations are not, or desires, that's a form of desire, are not considered, we will never have peace, because duty will never be, or obligations never be able to compensate. Now, desire has many meanings, from aspiration to greed, lust. And I did a search for pictures, a search for legitimate aspirations, and I got these three very different pictures. So it covers a lot. There's a lot of literature that covers the question of desire, philosophy, social sciences, psychology, and so on. For unification thought or worldview, desire is an impulse of the mind to achieve a certain purpose. The notion of purpose is usually not considered in contemporary scholarly writings about desire. The purpose is just whatever I want. For unification thought, it's the purpose of creation, which we find in some other very few theological writings. So unification thought does not see the need to repress desires, neither, of course, the need to follow them indiscriminately, but rather to reverse the desires, the order of desires, by putting the spiritual desires in a position of leading position, physical desires that are absolutely needed in a position to follow. For Kant, spiritual desires don't exist. It's duty. So one point one conclusion on this is that the NGOs are largely using the language of desire or aspirations. They are acting in response to human needs and aspirations. So basically, they do the job that the United Nations itself cannot do by working through laws, regulations, and imposing decisions, and so on. And we all know that the NGOs do much of the real work at the United Nations. It's the desire to help, to fulfill people's aspirations. Now, I will conclude with just this presentation on more specifically how that works in the view of unification thought and in the view of this very young peace scholar, Torren Hansen, who sees three branches of peace: the desire for peace within, that's mind-body unity, that's peace between, relational unity, and peace among, with the environment. It's a very interesting paper that he wrote on holistic peace. Of course, it's biblical language. It's also common sense. You find bits and pieces everywhere, and it reflects unification thought. Now, peace within, and I didn't receive a 3 minutes warning, but my clock says otherwise. I'm already 3 seconds over, so I will stop with peace within. At least is acknowledged even by the United Nations today, as I discovered with Dr. Ward in a recent visit. As you can see on this not very impressive mural, I mean, artistically not very impressive, it says next to the, Sustainable Development Goals, peace begins with me. And I leave you with that. Thank you.
Dr. Perrottet, please, let's give him a round of applause. And I'm very sorry, Dr. Perrottet, that I didn't say the 3-minute warning long enough, loud enough. Yes, but thank you for that presentation. Yeah, it's very interesting. A lot of, I wrote down more notes, things to think about and consider. Yeah, this, it was very interesting thinking about this call of duty of to make peace, and it's demanded by human reason in Kant's view. And it just made me think of Dr. Ward's point about well, humans, we are actually primarily emotional.
Yes.
So, just thinking about how those two things can, I guess, intersect and, find how does that work together? The pursuit of peace can't just be based on reason, because there's that's that in the conflict there's so many emotional elements, even overrides the reason. The reason, it goes out the window. So anyway, thank you so much, Dr. Perrottet. Please, everyone, again, post your comments in the chat. At this point, we're going to hear from our respondent to both Mr. Kennedy and Dr. Perrottet's presentation. And so we will welcome up Dr. Basil Ugorji. Dr. Ugorji holds a PhD in conflict analysis and resolution from Nova Southeastern University and has an expertise in peace and conflict resolution. He is a founder and CEO of the International Center for Ethno-Religious Mediation. So please, Dr. Ugorji, your response.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Katerina. I truly appreciate the honor and the privilege to be invited to respond to these wonderful, great scholars. I just want to make a confession. I am not an expert in American history, but I could respond to American interventionism in many countries. But I want to begin by, first of all, responding to Dr. Perrottet's presentation. Then I'm going to connect it to Mr. Chris' presentation on American interventionism. The discourse on peace and international relations, well, of course, both presentations are based on peace and international relations. And Dr. Perrottet really made it very clear that they have been deeply influenced by Immanuel Kant's seminal work on perpetual peace. And Kant's proposition of perpetual peace as both an ideal and a moral principle significantly shaped the understanding of peace in the realm of international affairs, which of course has greatly influenced the work of the United Nations, as well as was very instrumental in founding the United Nations. However, as Dr. Perrottet mentioned, it is crucial to recognize that Kant himself acknowledged the daunting task of fully achieving perpetual peace, envisioning perpetual peace more as an ongoing process rather than a goal that will be fully achieved. Dr. Perrottet's presentation raises a pertinent, a very important question regarding the feasibility of Kant's vision, looking at it from a historical point of view, especially the issues that we have really been witnessing in many countries around the world in terms of conflict escalation and violence and wars. And so it seems to Dr. Perrottet that this idea is elusive and might not definitely work very well the way Immanuel Kant envisioned it. And so he now suggests reevaluating Kant's emphasis on solely Kant's emphasis solely on duty. All right. So he proposes an integration of human desires into peace studies, and this is really very powerful, arguing that the fulfillment of legitimate desires among all parties could serve as a more practical guarantee for lasting peace. And so one question that, as I was listening to him, that I believe probably should have been addressed is, are desires, right, human desires, the same as interest, underlying interest? That is a very important question because in most conflict resolution literature, many authors, many scholars have placed emphasis on interest, underlying interest rather than desires. But again, that is something that I am kind of thinking about. One example is Kenneth Cloak. Kenneth Cloak is the co-founder of Mediators Beyond Borders. In one of his books, which was published in 2001, Mediating Dangerous, The Frontiers of Conflict Resolution, Kenneth Clark really proposes a shift, right? A shift from power, rights, to interest. In Dr. Paratet's word, I'm going to say desires, but that needs to be clarified. And so how can we identify and address underlying interests of each party in any of the conflicts that we encounter? And that's basically some of the things that Dr. Paratet was trying to explain. But one way, I believe, of achieving this could be through Habermas. He's from the philosophical tradition. I happen to have also studied philosophy, but I was really fascinated by Habermas' communication action, which is an emancipatory communicative act that results in reflection, intersubjectivity, and mutual understanding. Or Jack Measor's transformative learning that transforms frame of reference and results in a change of perspective. Those are two powerful philosophers that I believe really probably went beyond Immanuel Kant in that perpetual peace idea. And now let's go to conflict resolution that he is actually proposing. The scholars from the negotiation program at Harvard, one of them or three of them wrote a book called titled Getting to Yes. And they suggest that we move away from positional bargaining, separate the people from the problem and focus on interests and not positions. And again, here comes that emphasis on interest, on in Dr. Paratet's word, desires, underlying interest. So these interests could be content, they could be topical, they could be relational, identity-based interest. They could also be process interest. That means the process by which the conflicts could be resolved. And I'm really happy that Dr. Paratet really refers to the unification thought perspective on repulsion and attraction, right? So that's really very interesting. And that, for me, he says here that the force of repulsion is originally latent, does not surface. And that is in line with what Denis Sandol, one conflict resolution expert, he was a professor at George Mason University Conflict Analysis and Resolution Program. Unfortunately, he passed away in 2018. But in 2008, he came up with stages of conflict manifestation. And according to him, conflict is a process characterized by stages of initiation, escalation, controlled maintenance, de-escalation, and some kind of termination. And that control maintenance is a time where probably there could be ceasefire, and then afterwards there could be termination, settlement, resolution. And that, for me, is a time of transcendence, moving away, try to transform the situation and the people involved in this very conflict. And that is in alignment, though, with Jean-Paul Lydarac's view on building peace, how to achieve sustainable reconciliation in divided societies, where he affirmed a paradigm shift, three paradigm shifts, which are very important, from a concern with the resolution of issues, to rebuilding relationships, from the realm of realism, okay, to addressing accumulated perceptions and deep-rooted hatred and fear. And those, for me, probably what Dr. Paratet is referring to, those desires, underlying issues, and interests, from a mechanical strategy to reconciliation as a central component of peace building. And now mechanical, moving away from mechanical, status diplomacy, and this is where Mr. Chris' presentation now becomes very relevant, very important. The U.S. foreign interventions, okay, based on the responsibility to protect, that principle, responsibility to protect. And so what kind of strategy is it? And so listening to Mr. Chris, a few questions really resonated with me. So it seems to me that the US is a little bit selective, and I'm glad Mr. Chris mentioned it, with respect to where and when to intervene. And I'm wondering why the US did not intervene in Rwanda in 1994 to stop the genocide against the Tutsis based on the responsibility to protect principle. And that was actually a time when that responsibility to protect principle was being implemented. And the president then looked to the other side. Even the United Nations failed, although the UN Security Council established a peacekeeping mission called the UN Assistance Mission for Rwanda in 1993 before the genocide. So the Rwandan genocide did not just happen. There were warning signs, okay, that could have really, motivated many people like the United States to intervene based on that principle to protect. Now, the plan was that killed the prime minister, the president of Burundi and Rwanda in 1994 April, since prior to the genocide, was one of the warning signs. But again, those things did not really drive the United States or change their reason why they did not initially want to intervene. President Bill Clinton and the government closed their eyes and refused to intervene. And the argument that the Clinton administration gave was that they did not want to engage in another failed mission, citing the US failed intervention in Somalia some months before the genocide. But in October 2011, just about 10 years afterwards, the US with some NATO members coordinated and executed an intervention in Libya that resulted in the killing of Muammar Gaddafi on October 20, 2011. And since that time, Libya and the countries in the Sahel region have been really, or have seen an unprecedented increase in terrorism activity. So this is something that I believe should really be addressed. And I yield and I asked Dr. Harate to make that distinction between desires and underlying interests. And then Mr. Chris will address why the US did not intervene in Rwanda in 1994. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Dr. Ogorji. Actually, he put a question to two of our panelists, and now we are starting our Q&A session. So I think we can start by Dr. Perete and Mr. Kennedy. Please go ahead and respond to those questions.
Yeah, first of all, my apologies to Dr. Ogorji and to everybody else, but everybody else doesn't know. Dr. Ogorji had the benefit of having my presentation that I sent him in advance, and he responded to a part of it that I was unable to get to tonight. That was actually dear to my heart, but time is time. Concerning interest, yes, this is one of the many, there's a lot, as I said, I think in the Pali Canon of Buddhism, interest translates 17 different words. So this, it can be many, desire is translated, 17 different words are translated into as desire. So interest is certainly is a proper, very similar, and it fits the perspective I have about interest. The reason about desire, the reason I use desire is just simply because Kant uses it. So I said that's why. I could have used many other words. He uses desire. He uses a German word, Begierde, which really it's very close to the word for greed, Gier. So it's not a beautiful word in German. But anyway, that's the word he uses. It's also very fundamental in that sense that human beings have certain desires. And if we all have the same desires as human beings, and if you believe that there's a God who somehow coordinates all this, then the prospects for peace are much higher. I didn't get to speak about that. So desire is very fundamental, but interest is essentially, it's a form of desire, yeah. There's needs as well. Needs is also very much present in international relations and is considered much more acceptable than desire, but it's actually very much related.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And Mr. Kennedy, response to.
So this is a question regarding the recalcitrance or the inability of American intervention in the 1994 Rwandan genocide, yes?
Yes.
My understanding from the background surrounding that event is that there were warning signs. It was even being somewhat broadcast on the radio stations in Rwanda. But once it started, it happened very quickly. America was not in the business of preventative action at that time. Most interventions were interventions. It wasn't a matter of stopping people from doing something, it was stopping them from continuing to do something. The issue is that once the genocide started, it was like a locust wave. It kind of just swept across the country over the course of, I think, about a week or so. By the time people got in, tens of thousands were already dead. Now, that said, there was another factor. There's a famous story from World War II when Hitler was moving his divisions towards the Soviet border. Until that time, Stalin and Hitler actually had a good relationship. Stalin even said that he trusted no one in the world except for Hitler. This madman, this utter psychopath, trusted Hitler more than any other person. So when those German divisions came towards the border, the Soviet soldiers called Moscow. They said, what do? We're getting all this chatter. We see soldiers moving towards the border. We think they're going to attack. And Stalin said, Hitler would never do that. He promised not to. He refused to believe that this crazy thing would happen. Even though all the signs were there, he did not believe it until after the Nazi soldiers began their invasion. They had been invading for 3 days. Stalin went into shock. He went into reclusion for a week. And when he came back, he started using nationalist speeches. He completely changed personalities. He had always hated nationalists. He'd never cared about the motherland, the Rodina, before then. But once he was betrayed, once this impossible thing had happened, he completely shifted the way he spoke and acted. And this is to say that this idea of that kind of genocide was not believable as such. We knew it could happen because of the Holocaust and other things, but no one thought that it would happen so quickly. So it was a combination of it happening so quickly and people not really believing it could happen. That's my understanding of the situation. Is that sufficient, Dr. Agorgi? There you go.
Yes, there's a lot of comments and posts in the chat as well on this topic, very hot topic. If we could also bring Dr. Ward back up for a few questions. There were several questions also on this the Han narrative and China and Taiwan. So if I could, there's a couple questions that are a little bit related. First is from Robert Kittle. He says, of course, thank you for your presentation. How do you balance flexibility with acquiescence to a perceived evil? And also related from William Stoner, Pax Americana is possible, but diplomacy will not protect us or the world from communism. It's a value system that empowers those nations to sacrifice human life at any cost. And so how will we be able to respond to those perceived evils that Mr. Stoner identifies: Russia, China, North Korea? That's for Dr. Ward, and also if anyone else would like to respond.
Yeah, I'd like to remind everybody what my topic dealt with. I dealt with Taiwan and China. I didn't deal with America and China. My focus was specifically Taiwan and China. Taiwan is in a very disadvantageous situation. it's a small country. But by the way, I had the opportunity a few years back to spend 6 months in Taiwan, and had lots of interface with people during my time there as a resident scholar with the Taiwan Foreign Ministry. So I was really blessed to be able to spend that time and understand their perspective. And basically, a lot of the people that I had a chance to work with there, they were people connected to the government and things, and they really emphasized that one of the most important things was to delay things as long as possible, to talk as long as possible. And in terms of Taiwan and China and the future of Taiwan, the reality, quite simply, is that China is not yet in a position where it has confidence that it can do what it feels that it has to do eventually if Taiwan doesn't acquiesce to what it expects. But they're not there yet. And they calibrate things very carefully. Those of you who've taken my class, I often talk about how basically in the middle of the next decade, Chinese military expenditures will begin to exceed those of the United States. And once that starts, it never stops. They are going to become a huge force militarily. They've already become a huge force economically. And so really the issue, dialogue, discussion is extremely important if we're going to be successful in what we try to do. So we know the issues with China, but there are two things that are here that we have to hope for. One is that people in Taiwan and all of us have to understand about the China narrative. Someone asked, I saw it in the chat, someone asked that question. It's relevant to this question. The reality is that the narrative is an official narrative pretty much, but it reflects also just that, in 1839, when the Opium Wars began, it was a moment of shock for China, because what China had not perceived or understood was that somehow Europe had developed an incredibly sophisticated capability, both technically and also logistically, in terms of waging wars. And therefore, it was just a matter of days where suddenly China, which for so long had viewed itself as the center of the world, that all changed. It was a great humiliation. Read Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. In there, he specifically over and over again lauds China. He says that it's kind of stagnant, but it was a great political economy, which had a tremendous impact in the world. So I know I see your pointing. So I don't want to go too long, but so just simply keep in mind, we're talking about the dynamic between Taiwan and China, not the U.S. and China. That was not my topic tonight. That's a different topic.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ward, for your answer. In the interest of time, I would like to remind everyone to please keep your answers brief so that we can get to some more questions. I know there's many things to talk about, and it's like unraveling many different aspects. This question is for, Dr. Perete from Chisoni Ngoma. How can Kant's categorical imperative be applied in practice in resolving conflicts, say, between North and South Korea? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, the categorical imperative, I just have to clarify a little bit. It has various forms, but it means, in simple language, the call of conscience to do the right thing. But Kant gave, he says you should always act in such a way that what you do or what you decide can be used as a universal maxim. In other words, I do something. At the same time, I think anybody else in that situation should do the same thing. I don't do it just because it's convenient for me. I do it because it's the right thing. So this universal, and never treat other people just as means. They can be means to something, but tools to something, but they are essentially an end, a purpose in themselves. So that's the categorical imperative. And indeed, when Kant speaks of reason, the duty of reason, he means that, the practical reason. Now, how this can apply to North Korea and South Korea, I must admit that I'm a little bit, I don't know, I'm stunned by the question, which is not to say that the question is wrong or bad or anything. It just means that I'm limited on this point, because essentially a call to conscience is probably difficult when dealing with a regime like North Korea, with any political regime, to be quite honest. There's no regime on earth, including the United States, that will just act based on what is right, but certainly not North Korea. So I don't see that as being a very useful approach. Perhaps that's just now, maybe in 5 minutes, I come up with something else for that. Sorry.
Thank you so much. I felt that was very informative, and I hope the person who asked the question felt you answered it appropriately according. So I also wanted to make sure if there was anybody else who would like to comment on anything, please feel free to jump in. We don't have to limit to one person responding. We can get a conversation going. I wanted to turn to Dr. Walsh's question. He says, thank you very much for presenting. This is addressed to Dr. Ward, the narrative theory. But he says, however, emphasis on narrative also opens us up not only to a single or dominant narrative, but to a proliferation of stories or narratives. So do you advocate an approach to peace or mediation that honors both narrative approaches and approaches rooted in the effort to arrive at true understanding through rational analysis of circumstances independent from narrative? So if maybe Dr. Ward could respond, and if anybody else would like to add something.
Well, yes, obviously, I think the latter part of your comment, Dr. Walsh, is very valid. Of course, we need to have a rational approach to these issues and a realistic approach to these issues. The narrative is just a way to have a better understanding of our counterpart, how they're thinking and what they're doing. And certainly in the case of Taiwan, you have two competing narratives. You have the narrative of the Greens, so to speak, the Democratic People's Party, and you have the narrative of the Kuomintang. The Greens, so to speak, they want to see an independent Taiwan, and they particularly reflect the view of especially pre-1949 Chinese who are on the island of Taiwan, whereas the Kuomintang they believe, as Chiang Kai-shek believed, that eventually all of China must become one, but it must be a free and democratic China. So anyway, those narratives are helpful, I think, in diplomacy to really get to the very roots of them and the rationales for them. Thank you.
Katarina, your voice cut off.
I'm sorry, my sound. Just asking if there's anybody else who would, in our panel, who would like to also comment on the question. Otherwise, we'll move on to the next question. Okay. So this question comes from William Lay. Thank you, everyone. Of course, we all thank for your presentations and responses. This is, oh, excuse me, I'm sorry. I picked the wrong question. I wanted to change to allow everyone to respond to something. This is from Andrew Wilson. Is the American narrative to intervene around the world rooted to some degree in Christianity's Great Commission? And is America's retreat from the mission to promote its values militarily and politically connected to the decline of Christianity and its loss of self-confidence? I believe that's addressed to Mr. Kennedy.
And I'd like to see the text of that question so I can get it filled out.
Let me send it to you again. I'll read it. Is the American narrative to intervene around the world rooted to some degree in Christianity's Great Commission? That's the first part. And the second part is America's retreat from the mission, from that mission to promote its values militarily and politically connected to the decline of Christianity?
All right, so there's no denying that America is a Christian nation. Or rather, I've heard people try to deny this, but they do so very badly because they are wrong. America is based upon primarily Western Christian values. It has a very strong inheritance from those values, Kantian values too. That said, whether or not America is trying to inject Christian values in other parts of the world is a bit more contentious. There was a period where that was certainly true, particularly around the 1900s. Early in the 1900s, that was a big thrust for all imperialism, not just America, but every European nation had that as some component of their foreign policy. You might remember from world history the phrase God, gold, and glory. The desire to spread Christianity has always been a component in selling foreign policy for one reason or another. The relative decline of Christian values in the West is not necessarily tied to the fatigue of militant intervention. In many ways, there's a strong argument to be made that if you have to militarily impose your values, you are not imposing Christian values. That is a valid point of view. That said, it is true that Christian nations are typically willing to fight for their values, though this is not unique to Christian nations. So I wouldn't say it's necessarily tied to the decline of Christianity in the West, that America is no longer as willing to intervene militarily. I think that's just a cyclic fatigue. Societies tend to move in cycles over history. There are periods of expansion, there are periods of strong economic growth, and there are periods of contraction, where you need to internally restructure before you can begin again. China actually has that idea built into its Taoist philosophy. It has its 5 elements. And each of its 5 elements corresponds to a period of social dynamic. So that's already in their way of thinking over time. And Dr. Ward might know more about that. He's more an expert, really, in the Oriental sphere. But that is my general response to that question. If you'd like more, please let me know.
Okay, thank you so much. If there's anybody else, please feel free to jump in. Otherwise, we'll move on. This will be our final question. So if we can keep the response brief, even though it is the answer can be very long. So how would Dr. Ward compare the geopolitical intentions and subsequent narratives of the PRC and ROC?
Well, thank you. That's a very good question. I think there's 2 answers to that. I mean, we understand the geopolitical intentions of the PRC, first of all, are to recoup all of what it views as its former territory. And they've been very articulate and outspoken about that. However, so was Chiang Kai-shek. And even all of the issues that surround the South China Sea and the claims in the South China Sea, they originate with Chiang Kai-shek. So there are 2 different systems of thought in Taiwan. There is the thought of the Greens. They want an independent Taiwan. They do not want to be part of China. And there is the thought of the Kuomintang. And their thought is that they want to reunite with China and that it will be a free and democratic China. What will be the political intentions and the views of that type of a China? I think that's something that we can't say, but if it is guided by rule of law and democracy, as it has been, then I think that it will be certainly something an entity with which we can comfortably negotiate and communicate with and successfully be able to deal with as a fellow key country in terms of the future of our world.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Ward, for your very pointed and clear answer. I know there's much more to say. I've been reading the chats, and I feel like in the spirit of this conference and this session, this dialogue is just so important, where we can talk out our perspectives, the way we see things, so that we can come to a better understanding of each other. That's something that I gained from the presentations, the need to have a better understanding of each other, and that dialogue, the diplomacy that we're talking about, that is so important to arrive to a better, more peaceful world where conflict will happen, but resolving those conflicts will be done in more peaceful ways. So we're just taking steps bit by bit. And I just thank you everyone for joining us in this conversation. That concludes our panel for this session. I thank all the panelists and responders again for all your comments and answering these questions. I'm sorry to everyone that we couldn't get to all of your questions. Again, the recording for this session will be on the HJI YouTube channel. And the next session of this conference will begin at 8:45 p.m. Christology and Women, Relevance for Peace. It will be the same link as this one. So we will see you again soon. Thank you very much.